Hello, good people of YouTube and BitChute. Elagabalus Rex back here with you. For this video, I wanted to talk about one of the few subjects that I have the ability to talk about with any authority, which is singers, specifically three: Bob Dylan, David Bowie, and Prince. Now, of course, anyone that's familiar with the history of pop and rock in the West they don't need any introduction to these singers. They're three of the most well-known, influential, and important singer-songwriters in the history of the genre, of the art form, assuming you consider rock to be an art form, which I do. Um, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. Specifically, what I wanted to point out is that there seem to be some very interesting parallels and similarities between these three creators in terms of personality, in terms of theme, subject matter, uh, career trajectory, uh, so many things. Like I said, it surprises me that not more writers and historians and commentators and other rock artists and such haven't picked up on it. I'm surprised I haven't, gone into Half Price Books or Barnes and Noble or Borders or wherever, and come across in the music section some book that says the great musical rock triumvirate: Dylan, Prince, Bowie. Because in my opinion, they do represent one of sorts. There is thematically and stylistically um, a kind of interesting musical continuum running through their works between them, from the early albums and songs of Bob Dylan in the early 60s when he first began to make his mark on the musical world, extending through the 70s, through the career of Bowie, and then transitioning in the early 80s and to the end of the decade of the 80s and even beyond in the works and the albums of Prince. Now, to recap, just for those who don't maybe aren't maybe as well versed on the chronology of their careers, Bob Dylan, who was born in 1941 as Robert Allen Zimmerman, um, came out with his first album in '61, self-titled, uh, and then had and had a run of success and fame and notoriety. With his albums and his songs that extended through the entire decade of the 60s and well into the 70s. In fact, I don't think it was really until about 1978 that he really began to taper off in terms of critical attention and sales. Although, of course, he continued to go on tour and to generate work and albums, and he continues to do so to this day, as far as. And in fact, Dylan of the Three is the only one who, at the time of the making of this video, is still alive and well at the age of 78, I think. I think he was born in 1941, so yeah, I think he would be 78 or 79 by now. Uh, Next, you have David Bowie, who was born in Brixton, which is a suburb of London, in 1947. Actually, he shares the same birthday as Stephen Hawking and Elvis Presley. Now, Bowie arrived on the scene being, I think, 7 or 8 years younger than Dylan. He arrived on the scene a little bit too late for the party of the 60s, free love and hipsters and all that. He had his first big hit in 1969 with Space Oddity. He had his first hit album in 1971 with Hunky Dory, and he broke big into superstardom, of course, with 1972. 1972's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. And he retained that superstardom for about, I would say about 13 or 15 years. That would be from Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars in '72 all the way up through the Glass Spider album, which came out in 1987, I believe, which is interestingly also the year I was born. Geez, sometimes I already feel old. Anyway, so Bowie's heyday lasted from about the early 70s up to about the mid to late 80s. Then Prince began to make a name for himself in turn, beginning at the tag end of the 70s, early 80s, and that extended in turn through most of that decade. And he didn't really begin to lose critical favor until after about 1988 or so, if memory serves me correctly. and his financial and commercial successes with his albums more or less came to an end in about the mid 90s, 1994, 1995, or thereabouts. Um, so we have, like I said, a musical continuum here that lasts, in other words, from the early 60s all the way up to the mid 90s, which was the time, like I just said, that Prince had his last commercial successes to speak of. Now, why do I call it a musical continuum? Well, because it seems to me they dealt with a lot of the same themes and made their mark and became extremely respected and admired and followed by so many millions of people for a lot of the same reasons. Um, for one thing, all three were obviously singularly blessed with singular voices. All three had very unique sounds. I mean, they had very audiologically unique um, sounds and timbres to their voices. You could anytime you hear a song by Dylan or Bowie or Prince, within a few seconds you know who it is. They were blessed with the gift of a distinctive sound to their instruments. So there was that. Also, they seem to, at least to it seems to me, they seem to deal with a lot of the same themes in their music. That would be themes of uh, deprivation, social deprivation, alienation, spiritual and psychological collapse, um, inner frustration and turmoil. Um, in other words, all very fringe and introspective artists in a spiritual and psychological sense. All three dealt with pretty weighty and heavy subject matter. Um, there is exceptions, of course. I mean, all three of these singer songwriters wrote lighter and sillier material. Um, all Pretty much all artists do at some point or another, unless you're Kate Bush, I suppose. Um, so yeah, they were definitely not lightweight in terms of the subject matter that they covered in their songs. Um, they scrutinized all three scrutinized society. They acted as society's mirror. They saw all three looked around them and they saw the corruption. They saw the hypocrisy and the cruelty and the wantonness and the deceit and all the bad things that were lacking um, with the times in which they lived, and they reflected them in their songs. You get so you have Dylan's "Mom, Hey Mom, Only Bleeding," or "Like a Rolling Stone," or Bowie's "Rock and Roll Suicide," or Prince's "Controversy," or "Sign of the Times." Uh, In fact, in one good example of this parallel is one of the most famous lines in one of Bob Dylan's most famous songs, "Like a Rolling Stone," or rather, excuse me, "The times they are a changing," is obviously the phrase that "the times they are a changing." In 1984, in Purple Rain, there's a line in there that says, "Honey, I know the times are changing." An exact duplicate, almost word for word. 20 years, written 20 years apart and then totally independent of each other. So there's that similarity. They were how would you say? All three were social iconoclasts. They sang and they spoke for the outcast and for the outsider, at least for the part of their careers that was the most important and the most vital. Another similarity: all three were highly private and highly introverted, at least at first. Bob Dylan, for example, is never really broken out of his shell. He remains, hidden in sight in a way. He does give interviews, but he doesn't really give away very much. He doesn't talk very much about, for example, his love life or his family life. He doesn't speak terribly much about his religion. He stays away from personal questions for the most part and always has. That's really never changed for Dylan. Bowie was very similar in the 70s and up through most of the 80s until he got to be about 40 or so. He gave, like Dylan, he gave many interviews, but he didn't really give much away. He spoke in a large part in riddles and in metaphor very cryptically and evasively. Also, usually not being very eager or willing to talk about his personal life or his love life or anything, or his family life or anything, germane or close to that. Prince was very much the same. In fact, sometimes Prince in interviews wouldn't even use words at all and simply use, facial expressions and hand signals and things like that. Um, he was very canny about manipulating and stonewalling the press as a career tool to create an aura of mystery and otherness to him. So all three were highly introverted and mysterious figures, at least for the better part of their careers. All three were multi-instrumentalists. Bob Dylan was fluent on the guitar, on the harmonica. He played piano, I believe. Bowie was a guitarist, was a pianist, could play the saxophone, could play drums. Prince could play everything. He played the majority of the instruments, as I understand it, on his first couple of albums, even. So all three were extraordinarily instrumentally versatile. Um, Bowie also released an album, Diamond Dogs, in 1974, in which he played most of the instruments, everything except the drums, I believe, and some of the piano. So that was kind of Bowie's. Diamond Dogs was, I like to call, Bowie's Prince album, in the sense that almost everything that you hear on it is Bowie. Um, yes, so multi-instrumentalist, all highly versatile. Um, all three, of course, they had stage names. None of them were born, you know, as the people whose names they used on stage. Um, Bob Dylan, born Robert Zimmerman. David Bowie was born David Robert Jones. Prince, of course, born Prince Rogers Nelson. Um, so yeah, I mean they all to some degree killed off the identities and the people, or the personas at least, that they were born with, and adopted new ones, down even to shedding part or all of their names. Um, yeah, so I mean, I have three books here, for example. Dylan, Bowie, and Prince. And as like I said, as I was reading them, they're all three biographies. As I was reading them, it just occurred to me that I'm reading a lot of very similar uh, a lot of very similar plot points. Another example of a similarity between them um, is that they had kind of similar career trajectories. All three were on top for about 10 years. Interestingly, Dylan was pretty much the leader of the pop and rock avant-garde in the 60s. Bowie took over, like I said earlier, in the early 70s, and then was in turn deposed as an avant-garde rock leader in the early 80s by Prince. Now, when Prince got to the end of his run of success around the end of the 80s and in the early to mid 90s, as far as I've tried really hard to think of someone who could be named to have taken over from him, who could be called a leader of the pop and rock avant-garde. There are a couple, contenders that I think you could make a case for. Jack White of the White Stripes, perhaps Trent Reznor, whom Bowie incidentally collaborated with on his 1997 album Earthling. Um, I suppose maybe Robert Smith of The Cure, but they were already kind of old hat by the mid '90s. So it's, in all honesty, hard to think of anybody who had the sheer musical and cultural impact of any of these three artists after the time of Prince. I mean, certainly you couldn't, no one could make a case, for the likes of Shania Twain or Britney Spears or Mariah Carey or Garth Brooks, all of whom, hit their commercial stride in the 90s as being avant-garde figures. I mean, no disrespect to them, of course. I mean, they were all very, very good at what they did. Um, but they simply didn't shake shake the musical world to its core in the way that the three artists, singer songwriters that I've been talking about did. Um, The market was simply too fractured and splintered and subdivided by then, um, for that to be the case ever again, really, as it remains to this day. I don't think we will ever again see the likes of Bob Dylan or Bowie or Prince, or, I can think of many other artists you could say the same, and bands. You could say the Beatles, the Stones, Led Zeppelin, Michael Jackson, Elton John, Madonna, so on and so forth. You just don't see their like anymore, because the musical world and the musical industry has completely shifted in its nature and in its meaning. Fortunately or unfortunately, however you want choose to look at it. But in any case, I digress. My point for this video, I guess, was just to point out that even though I think each of these three singer-songwriter artists have received their due and attention individually, by both media and historian types, I think it seems to me that no one's really drawn a really strong parallel between their three careers and the musical continuum that those three careers constituted from the early '60s up through the late '80s and early '90s. And I think that someone could and should, because I think it would be a really interesting study, and make for a very interesting book or monograph, um, to set them up side by side, and show how the one career kind of led and bled into the other. Just fascinating to me. All right, thanks for listening. Bye bye until next time.